Hello, folks. Welcome to the muscle tissue chapter. So the muscles are very similar to the skeletal system in the sense that there are multiple chapters. Chapter 5 was about skeletal tissue and how those bones formed and grew and mended. So things of that sort. And then chapter 7 and 8 were naming the bones, where they were located in the body and so forth. Same thing is going on for the muscles. Chapter 9 is going to be about muscle tissue, about muscle cells, how muscle tissue contracts and um, moves. And then chapter 10 and 11 are going to be broken down into axial muscle skeleton, axial muscles and appendicular muscles. So basically all the names of the muscles on the axial skeleton and the names of the muscles on the arms and legs, which is your appendicular skeleton. And then we're going to focus more on chapter 10 and 11 for the lab exam 3 and 4. And lab exam 1 and 2 are going to focus more on the bones. So we're going to cover a little bit about muscle tissues. That's going to be um, the names of the muscles and that sort. So independent names of the muscles. So let's get into chapter 9. So we remember from the tissues lecture that you have 4 kinds of tissues. You have epithelial tissue, you have connective tissue, you have muscle tissue, and you have nervous tissue. So and nervous tissue is in its own category. That's because they're both so unique, muscle and nervous tissue. They have their own categories and they have really no shared qualities with other types of tissues. And in terms of muscle, what kind of things can they do that the other types of tissues cannot do? Well, one muscle tissues are, they have excitability, they respond to stimulation. You can go ahead and stimulate them, and whether you're using a nerve or some type of electricity, they can respond. And when they respond, they can contract. So they have contractile, they shorten, they actively exert and pull. So they can contract. So the cells themselves literally become shorter. They're very, very unique characteristics of cells is that they can shorten, and depending on how long the uh, uh, fibers are, they can contract over a long range or short-lived range, and they can go back to their original length after they're done contracting. So that sounds pretty simple, but in reality, this is not magic. So we can go and look at science of this and figure out how exactly this happens. So they have extensibility. This is what I was saying earlier. Depending on extensibility, they contract over range of resting length, so either long or short. And then elasticity is they are able to return to their original length after contraction. So we're going to look at the microbiology or cell biology of it to figure out how these molecules and all of the ATP work together that causes muscles to contract. So it's a very, very complicated topic, actually. So the first thing we need to know is there are 3 kinds of muscles that you have or that we have as in animals. So you got this one kind that's called skeletal muscle, and then you have another one that's called cardiac muscle, and then you have one that's called smooth muscle. And then we'll do this in the lab. We'll look at more these muscles in more detail because you're going to be spending a lot of time looking at them under the microscope. So I'm not going to go into the little, micro details about it right now. But we'll go over how you can tell difference between the skeletal, cardiac, smooth muscle in the lecture. And then we'll do more in the lab. But the first thing we need to do is talk about how skeletal muscle is different compared to the other ones. So the skeletal muscle is basically the one that's voluntary. So the skeletal muscle is voluntary. Let me write that for you. Skeletal muscle is voluntary, which means that you can cause it to contract when you want to. So you can voluntarily cause it to contract, even though it's called skeletal muscle. A lot of it is connected to your skeleton, but not all of it. So for example, you got some muscles that are called sphincters. So these are muscles that are circular muscles that control the flow of the materials through a tube. So let me write that for you. So we have muscles called sphincters. And these are the circular muscles. There's an R there. That control the flow of materials through a tube. So basically, your GI tract, your digestive system, or maybe where your urine comes from, and that's where you have tubes, these sphincters. At the end of it, you're going to have these little circular muscles. These are called sphincters, and some of these circular muscles are actually skeletal. So you can actually voluntarily contract them. And these sphincters are not connected to your bone. So therefore, an example of a muscle that's skeletal, which is not connected to your bone, would be your anus. You have external anal sphincter that you can contract, and it's voluntary. And then you also have internal anal sphincter that's made out of smooth muscle that's involuntary. So, when you have to go to the bathroom really bad, and to do number two, and then you're trying to not have an accident, you're trying to control that external anal sphincter muscle that you have control over. At that point, your internal anal sphincter muscle is already open, and you're just trying to control the external one so you don't have an accident. And then we have the one that's called cardiac muscle, and this is the one, your heart. So this is the heart muscle. And this is going to be involuntary. And involuntary means you don't have a direct control over it. And I'm not saying you don't have any control over it. Obviously, you do have control over it, but you don't have a direct control over it. And what I mean by that is you can't just sit there and make your heartbeat go faster. That doesn't work. However, you could close your eyes and think of a really scary scenario, and they'll cause you to become scared, and this will activate your involuntary nervous system, which will cause your cardiac muscle to contract a little bit faster. So this is where you find that they look different under the microscope. So we'll look at that as well, and especially in the lab. And then the last one is going to be smooth muscle, and this is also involuntary. And this is going to be associated with all kinds of stuff that you don't have control over. So involuntary, you don't have direct control over it. Then the really great example of this would be your goosebumps. So last time we talked about your erector pili muscle, and those erector pili muscles are going to be associated with your hair, and they're going to be involuntary, meaning they don't have direct control, that you don't have direct control over them. But you could think of a scenario that was scary, and that might give you goosebumps indirectly. So it's not voluntary where you would be able to control it directly, but it's involuntary if you think of something scary that you might get goosebumps. And this is also that's found in your digestive system. So when your stomach growls, that's going to be your smooth muscle, and you don't have control over that. So that's air into your intestines and your stomach, and that's basically where you find all these muscles. So you might be curious to know what they look like under the microscope. So let me show you that. Okay, so I pulled up some images. So this is what skeletal muscle looks like under the microscope. You don't really see the beginning of it and the end of it. That means it's going to be a really long cell. And you can see that the nuclei are going to be flat. They're going to be pushed to the side. And then you have these vertical striations here, lines. These lines are called striations. And this is going to be an example of skeletal muscle. And if you were to look at it under the microscope, this is what it's going to look like. This is what smooth muscle looks like. It's going to have these wavy lines, and the nucleus is going to be a little bit fatter compared to the uh, compared to the skeletal muscle. It's not real flat like pancakes, and the big difference that you have between skeletal muscle and the smooth muscle is that you don't have those vertical lines that you had for skeletal muscle. You have these vertical lines here, but you don't have that for the smooth muscle. The last one is going to be the cardiac muscle. And this is what cardiac muscle looks like here. So you're going to see that you got some branching. That's a big feature of cardiac muscle. You see this is branching out. There's some branching here, so you can see branching all over on this photo. You don't see this in skeletal muscle or the smooth muscle. And the other thing you have here is that you can see that there's dark line here, and then you have another dark line here. So you can actually see the beginning and end of it. And then you also have this really big nucleus. That's another difference. So they don't, um, so those, they don't have these vertical striations, but you do see some of the lines there. And they have these things called intercalated discs. So they have those, and we're going to spend more time talking about some of those intercalated discs. So that's what they look like under the microscope. You can see that here as well. You can see the striations on the skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle is branching, has the intercalated discs and big nuclei. Smooth muscle is kind of wavy and also have bigger nuclei than the skeletal muscle. So what are the functions of the muscular system? So when the muscles are connected to the skeletal, that's gonna pull on the skeletal via these tendons, and that's gonna cause the skeletal to move, and this will help you to basically maintain posture. Sometimes when you got these backaches, and if you got something going on, you go to physical therapy, and then they help you do some exercises, and these exercises will cause your muscles to become stronger, and they'll help you maintain your posture a little bit better. And maybe even after childbirth, they'll have you do these Kegel exercises. The Kegel exercises are going to make the muscles in the pelvic area stronger, and that's going to support the organs in the area a little bit better. And in your generation right now, this has turned to be an epidemic, having neck aches and neck strain and eye strain and all those type of muscle issues. That's due to basically looking at your cell phones. And if you look over here, um, this is an example of a good posture, and this is an example of a poor posture. Basically, poor postures can put some pressure on your bones and muscles that can cause pain. So when you are at 0 degrees, if you know anything about physics, if you are 0 degrees, a heavy object is basically going to push down and support. And then the support is, it's not going to be as stressful for the body. It's going to be supported well, and you don't have to put you don't have to put any extra effort into it to maintain the posture. But if you lean over like this, you're going to have put, you know, lots of pressure, and it's going to be hard to maintain the posture. You might fall over. So if you look at these old churches in Europe, you'll see that the tall ones, they have this buttress on them to keep them straight. So they lean a little bit. So what happens when you lean or tilt your head? So this is kind of showing you 0 degrees. At 0 degrees, you're putting 10 to 12 pounds of pressure, and that's basically how heavy your skull is when you're looking at your phone. But as you change that to 15 degrees, the pressure changed to 27 pounds. So it doesn't mean your skull got heavier, it just means that there's more pressure on your body now. And then 30 degrees is 40 pounds, and 60 degrees is basically 60 pounds. So it's basically putting pressure on your vertebrae, and that's how you're tilting your head a little bit can put so much pressure. And we're not saying that your head is weighing more. Again, we're saying that you're putting more pressure on there. And then your head, as you tilt your head more and more and more, you can put a lot of pressure. And it's because of the angle. This is a little bit more exaggerated. This is going to squish the nerves that you have in this area, and you're gonna have to put a lot of effort into maintaining your balance. So if you want, you can go ahead and lean forward right now. And if you lean forward, you will start to feel a little bit pressure in the back. And the pressure in the back is basically your muscles contracting to keep you from falling over. That means it takes energy for you to stay up. If you're not completely balanced at 0 degrees, then it's going to be one of the features of the muscular system to maintain the balance. This maintains posture and your body position. Another function of the muscular system is to protect your organs, your skull, and here's protecting your brain, and your rib cage, and your heart, lungs. So that's about, in your abdomen here, and that means you know because you don't have any ribs on your abdomen, that means these soft organs, your intestines and your stomach and your liver and things like that, they don't have bones in order to protect them. You have muscles. Muscles are going to basically take a role of your skeleton, and that's going to protect the soft tissue. So these are muscles going around your soft tissues. And your abdominal muscle, maybe you thought maybe you have one layer of muscle, abdominal muscles, but we actually have three layers of abdominal muscles. The reason why you have three layers is because our ancestors, we walked on all fours, and gravity will be pulling down on your soft tissues downwards. So we evolved three layers, just enough to have enough support to maintain the protection over the soft tissues that you have over there in this area. And the other thing that it does is regulate entrance and exit of materials. So I mentioned this before, we have these sphincters. This is esophageal sphincter and controls the flow from esophagus to the stomach. This is pyloric sphincter. So you have these sphincters that are going to control, basically when you swallow food, food goes down the esophagus and goes through the sphincter. After it's in your stomach, there's another sphincter. And the purpose of these sphincters is to control the movement of things in a tube. So your esophagus, there's a sphincter. You control the entrance and the exit. So entrance of the food to the stomach, and here exit from the of the contents from the stomach to the next tube, basically your digestive system. So if you have acid reflux, then acid will burn down your throat. So that's when it's basically going up the sphincter. It's coming from your stomach. It's burning your throat. So that's going to be function of these sphincters, especially if in some pregnant people, they have this acid reflux due to the hormones. So that's when they're basically throwing up acid, and the acid is kind of going up the sphincter. So some of these sphincters are going to be voluntary and some are involuntary. And the ones that are going to be in the GI tract are the ones that are going to be involuntary. So those are made up of smooth muscle. Another function of the muscle is to maintain your homeostasis, basically your temperature control, control your body temperature and your internal temperature. We know when you get cold, you shiver, and that's because when you shiver, you're making the muscles contract, and that causes the muscles to contract, and that's burning up ATP. And when you have ATP burning, that means there's a chemical reaction. And one of the things about chemical reactions is they're going to be releasing heat, so exothermic. So chemical reaction is going to make you feel warm. So what's happening here is basically you have to maintain a homeostasis, and your body's basically like a thermostat, and you got these receptors in your body. If your body's too cold, and you got these receptors in your skin, that pre-nerve endings, they're going to go ahead and send a signal to your brain that you're pretty cold, temperatures falling below normal range, and then that's going to regulate, that's going to activate some of the skeletal muscles that are going to rapidly contract. You're shivering, which generates heat, and the temperature comes back up to normal. So if you are at normal temperature, that's going to tell your brain to stop shivering, and that's basically you have the opposite going on here. If you're too hot, then you sweat, but we're really focused on the muscle part over here. So we talked about what muscle types are and what they look like, and the functions of the muscle. So let's go ahead and look at the anatomy of the muscle next. That's what we have here. There's a big muscle here, and you're going to have to learn the names of it for exam 3 and 4. So you have, this is basically showing a big muscle here. You have your, biceps brachii, brachialis, triceps brachii, deltoid, all those muscles you're gonna have to learn the names of. So it's one of those muscles. It's going to connect to the bone. Where it connects to the bone, you have this tendon, which is made out of dense regular CT. And this tendon will integrate into periosteum. And periosteum is on the outside of the bone. And when this contracts, it's going to pull on the bone, cause the movement, and all those things I just said to you were part of the previous lectures. So when I said, if it went over your head, that means you need to go back and review the previous lectures. So this is made up of dense regular CT, and it's going to be connected to the periosteum on the bone. And when it pulls, it causes the bones to move. So at the microscopic level, each of these muscles are going to be organized into smaller components. So when you look at this, you'll see that we have got small little bundles. So there's these muscle bundles that are found inside this entire muscle, and that's called fascicle. So that is called fascicle. And when you pull out on one fascicle, there are smaller muscle fibers. And if you were to dissect into a fascicle, you get a single muscle fiber that looks like this. And this is surrounded by connective tissue, fascia. So one bundle of muscle fibers, and then if you were to dissect into this fascicle, that's what you get. And then you have multiple cells organized around the structure, and the structure is going to be called a fascicle. Okay, so here's what it looks like again. If you go ahead and look at the individual muscle, you got the connective tissue covering or CT covering around the outside. And that's going to be basically the connective tissue covering. And then tendons connect to the periosteum on the bone. This is a tendon made out of dense regular CT. And that's going to connect to the periosteum, which is on the outside of the bone. Because muscles need lots of energy, they need to have a signal to tell it to contract. So you're going to have lots of nerve endings, nerves and blood vessels, because you also need, nutrients there. So lots of blood vessels in there. The CT covering is actually going to be comprised of 3 layers. The layers that are around the entire muscle is called the outermost layer, is the epimysium. And that's made out of dense irregular CT. So this is around the entire muscle. So this one covers entire muscle. This is called epimysium. So that's what you can see here. Epimysium, it's going around the entire muscle. So if you have a muscle and then the covering around its epimysium, and then we have inside the muscle, we have this fascicle that's wrapped by perimysium, which is the next layer. It's the internal around the fascicle. This is the middle one. Peri stands for around. So I'm not sure why the middle one is called perimysium, but it's going to go around the fascicle, and you have perimysium, and that's going to organize all the nerves and the blood vessels. Another thing I want to remind you, if you remember from the previous lecture, epi means on top, and then myo means muscle. So epimysium is around the entire muscle. I wanted to remind you of that. And then the third one we have here is at microscopic level. It's called endomysium. And that's once you have your fascicle, you pull a single muscle fiber, and that's going to be found around a single muscle fiber. That's this one here. Endomysium is the innermost layer, and endo means inside. So endo means inner or inside. It's on a single muscle fiber. So you see innermost CT covering the smallest one that's going to be on the microscopic level, and that's going to go around each muscle fiber, which is going to be basically one of the fascinating things about human anatomy is when you start cutting into different areas, you start to see this trend that many things are organized into threes. So in this case, you have epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. So this is basically showing you the same thing in a different form here. we have the entire organ here, and we got one of the forearm muscles that could be the extensor digitorum, or it could be the extensor carpi radialis. So that would be the entire muscle here. And around this entire muscle is epimysium. So that's what's going around the entire muscle. It's a cross section. And then when you pull out one of the fascicles out of this entire muscle, and what's found around that is the perimysium. And then you go ahead and pull one of the single muscle fibers. You grab one of these guys, and it's going to be a bundle of fibers. That's going to be the smallest one at a microscopic level. Then there is a CT covering around it, and that's going to be called the endomysium. And you can tell that this is at a microscopic level, because you can see there is there is mitochondria here. This is mitochondria, and then you also have nucleus here. So you can tell that this is at a microscopic level. Mitochondria, and then you also have nucleus. So because you can see these organelles, it's at a cellular level, and that's going to have endomysium. So you got three layers. You got epimysium, perimysium, and endomysium. And they look very similar to each other, so that's very important that you know what scale you're talking about. So if you see a cross section, you cut into a muscle. And if you cook meat, there's this fascia around it, and that's all the connective tissue. That's basically what you're looking at. That's a CT covering. So, this CT covering kind of creates these compartments in the meat if you cook steak, and you cook with chicken. So that's all the fascia you might see. Okay. So at the end of the muscle, you have this white stuff that is called the tendon, and I already said the tendon is made out of dense regular CT. So your tendon is made out of dense regular CT. Let me write that down for you. So dense irregular CT will be found in the muscle covering, and also it's going to be in the skin, but that's the dense regular CT is going to be making up the tendons, and then the ligaments and the epineurosis. So that's going to be integrated, and it's going to integrate into the periosteum. And if you're, I don't know, seeing a chicken wing, this is a section outside of the fresh bone. So you got the membrane that's called the periosteum. And then that's interwoven with the periosteum and the bone tissue. So that's what's going to pull onto the bone when the muscle contracts. And I've seen many images of bodybuilders. So sometimes bodybuilders will lift weight that's too heavy for them, and then the tendons will actually rip away. So this part will actually rip away from the muscle, and you'll see that there's a really big bruise where they damage the muscle, and because they lifted weight that was too heavy for them. And then also you're going to have all types of nerves and blood vessels there, because you need to have lots of glucose and lots of ATP in order to make sure that this muscle contracts. So here's the most famous tendon. That's called the Achilles tendon. And this is named after the Greek demigod Achilles. It's made up of dense regular CT, and this tendon comes off of multiple muscles, your gastrocnemius, which is part of your calf, and your soleus. So, and then your tibialis posterior. A bunch of muscles make up this Achilles tendon, and this is showing a ruptured Achilles tendon here. Okay, so let's wrap up or recap. So we have your entire muscle here. If you do a cross section of your entire muscle, you have this epimysium, and clear the dysregularity. And then inside the epimysium, you have these bundles. These are called fascicles. And then if you zoom in on the fascicle, you have they're organized like this, and you have perimysium around it, and you have more bundles inside it, and then you have your individual muscle cells around those. You zoom in a little bit more, this is your individual muscle cell, and around it you have the endomysium. You got lots of mitochondria, ATP generating organelles, and nerves, and all kinds of stuff. So that's necessary to get the muscle contracted. So next portion of the video will be focusing on muscle contraction. So I'm gonna stop this one here, and I'll be making another video for the muscle contraction. So thank you for listening.